Right. So, second speaker of the day is Maxine Gillway, and hopefully you can see that slide. So, Maxine Gillway is the Centre Director for the Centre for Academic Language and Development at University of Bristol. Long experience in thinking about language, language development, teacher beliefs, curriculum assessment, and educational leadership. She's been director of the centre since 2016. She's very involved in her own disciplinary area in terms of English for academic purposes. She was involved in BALIP, the professional body for English for academic purposes in the UK. She's a visitor here among chemists today. We welcome her. She recently completed an EdD, bringing together two of her areas of interest around feedback and teacher beliefs. Maxine and I worked together, and she was telling me about some of her work in a chemistry context, and I realized she really had to be part of this program. So Maxine, thank you very much for visiting the community of chemists today. I will stop sharing my screen and allow you to share yours.
Right.
And hopefully we can enjoy your talk. So you should be able to share your screen now.
So yeah, I'm a bit of a interloper here, but I've been doing a lot of research on the international student experience, and I put international in brackets there because what's good for the international student is good for all students, has been my observation. And I've done a lot of this research through observation over the years, both observing classroom interaction, whether that's whatever sort of type of classroom that is, and also observing feedback. So I'm going to do this. I had aimed to do all of that, but I'm not going to do the part that's greyed out there. I'm not going to talk about the languages that I observed in chemistry lectures back in 2008. That is published in a very short article in Inform, which there was a link to in the sort of preamble to this webinar. I do recommend you have a little look at it because it talks about technical, academic, general, idiomatic and idiosyncratic sort of languages. Very short and easy to read. If you've read it, I'm happy to take questions on it if there's time at the end. But what I thought I'd focus on today is more my doctoral research, which was on feedback. And one of my participants was a chemist. I had another scientist and a social scientist there as well. And it got me really interested in chemistry again. And hopefully we'll have some learning points at the end. So back in 2008, I was lucky enough to attend a whole year of chemistry undergraduate units. I think there were about 8 different lecturers that took part, and I was alongside 4 international students that were our first participants in our international foundation program for chemistry students. And then I was sort of a student with them, and I helped unpack the language of chemistry for them in what we called link classes. So I'd do the reading of the textbook with them, attend the lectures with them, and then look at that through the lens of a linguist and look at cause and effect. How do chemists do cause and effect? How do they do problem solution? How do they do compare contrast? And sort of through that, exposing them to all the concepts again, helping their acquisition, because acquisition is about frequency of contact with these words and concepts. And yeah, really enjoyed that up until 2014 when things changed. Came back to chemistry in year 2 lab reports, where I did a bit of co-teaching with a chemistry colleague here at Bristol, again through observation and text analysis. And 2017-18 is when I did my data collection, and that was in a 3rd year undergraduate chemistry lab. The lab report that I looked at was written feedback. So he was thinking aloud for me and recording his thoughts as he was giving feedback. And then I looked at what became visible of those thoughts to the actual student in the public feedback, if you like. And then I also recorded some live in the lab oral feedback on what was also called lab reports or data summaries. So the lab report, 2,000 words written, the data summaries, 400 words. Written but with oral feedback. And more recently, I spent a day with some veterinary science students where I followed them through a case-based class, a practical class, a lecture, and then talked to them in a focus group. And that brought up all the same issues that I address in that Inform publication from 2014, which I'm not going to talk about today. But anyway, I hope I made the right choices and find something interesting for you. I put this this quotation from an old but good source, Bourdieu. We have Bourdieu quotes on our wall in our centre, basically saying no one was born speaking academic language. And these sort of quotes here are saying, interestingly, that you know, academic language is important even in scientific context, which is interesting to me because my research showed that my chemist was much more focused on language in their feedback than my social scientist, for example, who is an educational psychologist. And there's something there in that third point about the fact that you have to identify, I think this is what Sylvia was saying, you have to identify what are the important words for you and show that they are important to you by defining it, commenting it. But I would say really flag that what follows is a definition or is an explanation, because when I was sitting in the chemistry lectures, sometimes I got confused about whether the second, you know, the explanation phrase was the same or a different concept to the one that had just come before. So that has to be really carefully flagged, you know, that means. But yes, okay, so I wanted to have a little look about what I understand by language. And I've got some, the speech bubbles there are quotes from Ken Hyland, who talks about language being disciplinary, peculiar ways of representing reality. So peculiar to us outside of your discipline, but very unremarkable to you yourself. And us outside here, I'm talking about your students as well. Or he talks about its socially situated, recognized ways of using language. And it's so wonderful for me to hear what you're talking about here, because there's obviously this awareness of the importance of disciplinary discourse, and you're helping to socialize students into their academic practices and valued ways of thinking. I spent a lot of my time, well, about 6 years in the Emirates, working with mathematicians and computer scientists, trying to persuade them of the value to include an intended learning outcome of language in their lessons. So it's wonderful to hear that being discussed here. But for me, language is more than words, it's about genre. You've probably come across genre in the context of films or music. In language, this is what it means in Jean Swale's term there. So it can be spoken, a presentation would be a genre, can be written, an essay. It varies in complexity and frequency. So my lab reports that I talked about earlier were genre. But they were different levels of complexity and length. They're all realized through language, and the choice of language depends on the communicative purpose. The structure will also depend on that communicative purpose and who you're communicating with. They vary in prototypicality, so the lab report that you might be taught in a textbook might be slightly different from the one you're expected to produce in your second year of chemistry, which might be slightly different from the one in the third year of chemistry, which might be slightly different from the one in your biochemistry class or in your physics class. And they're not static, they evolve. So another genre would be the research article, for example. If you think about how the research article has changed with the advent of open source online publications, it's changed the order that things are organized in, etc. So all these things are discoverable through text analysis, and we try to make our students genre detectives, is what we call it. We try to help them discover these things themselves, but obviously being guided by you as to what to notice is really important, because all of these genres are contextually bound. They're different in different contexts. And this is why the physical sciences are so challenging. Work of Nessie and Gardner, they put together huge corpora, huge databases of written language, the British Academic Corpus of Written English, and they looked at what they call genre families. And this was a pie chart showing the genre families for physical sciences as they defined them. And you can see the list of different genres there, some of which you might recognize, some you wouldn't. So methodology recount might be a section of a lab report, for example. But I think what I should have done probably is show you the pie chart for humanities. There were about 3 segments on that pie chart. Look at the number of segments here for a physical scientist. So we have to be really, really clear with our expectations, which is again came in that the model of PSLK that Sylvia was sharing, clarity of expectations. Just to show you, the last course that I taught in science was with nanoscientists, and these are in that course, a year master's course, they had how many there? 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 different genres, 7 different ways of communicating information, which would involve different choices of language. And language gets even more complicated. Here I've just got a picture of what a postgraduate natural science student, a fictional one here, that's in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages companion volume, which is accessible online. It's a series of can-do statements, what you can do with language. And when we think of language, we often think of receptive and productive skills. So receptive being your reading and your listening, productive being your speaking and your writing. But in this companion volume 2020, they've really padded out, really expanded on what is meant by mediation and interaction. And if you look at some of those things in mediation, collaborating to construct meaning, encouraging conceptual talk, facilitating collaborative interaction. Those are things that all our students need to do, not just international students or students operating in a second language that this is designed for. And the same with interaction, those things over there, informal discussions, formal discussions, goal-oriented cooperation. And if you look at the volume there, that will give you lots of can-do statements that you need to think about, what your expectations are for your students. We're working with our admissions team on looking at this at the moment. So that's one aspect of language, but for me, language fundamentally is about choice, not rules. You establish what genre you're dealing with, what's your purpose, what's your audience, and then you make choices. This stems from something called systemic functional linguistics. So language is a system of functions achieved by language. Halliday's theory is very, very dense. I wouldn't recommend that you try to engage with it. But the book to the left there, Kaplan's book, is a really accessible way in to the SFL theory. And what we talk about for our learners is basically that they have to make choices at 3 levels to control the meaning of what they're saying. So ideational, textual, and interpersonal are the SFL terms. Ideational, what is the content? So here's a little extract from a feedback comment, which is focusing on content, basically. A lot of it isn't really relevant. The student was talking about palladium when supposed to be talking about something different. I can't remember what the aim was. Textual, how's the message organized? So here's a very simplistic, why is the caption at the top? A lot of feedback, this is only about organizing the visual information, but visual information was very, very important in the feedback in the sciences. And then interpersonal, who's your audience? And you might say, well, this is about content again, but as I said, the choice of content depends on who your audience is. Okay, so the level of discussion, the level of detail you're going to be putting in depends on your audience. So we simplify this to say to our students, you need to make choices about your content, your organization, and your language, depending on your audience and on your purpose. So we have to make that audience and purpose really clear for our students and make sure that we're assessing them on the same audience, because the choices would be different otherwise. So here's an example of what I mean here by an expert writer. So when you see this, you're probably able to guess the context. You'd recognize that as a title. Here's another title. Same information, same research being presented in a different genre to a different audience with a different purpose. And so the writer has made different choices. You can see different choices there in terms of the length of the communication. You've got verbs in the first one, it's all noun based in the second one, there's a lot more detail in the second one. You can see all those differences. And if I tell you, you probably already guessed, this is nanoscience, by the way, but the first one was an outreach publication, so aimed at a general audience. The second was that same research in a journal article. So really make the expectations of the audience clear, so that students can make the best genre-based choices for that context. I was working with water environmental management master's course, and they gave the students this wonderful assessment task, which was all based on the World Health Organization, presenting a report for the World Health Organization, but then they assessed it using academic criteria, which is just a mismatch, because your choices of language would be different if you were communicating with the World Health Organization to whether you were communicating with your academic assessor, should we say, academic lecturer. Okay. Oh my goodness, am I on that long already? So in the words of a chemist, half of it's about interpreting their results, the other half is about communicating their results. This was in the context of the lab report genre. But what does communicating mean? That's what we have to make clear. And in the case of this colleague, more than half of their comments were about language. In the written feedback mode, 60% on the lowest scoring texts were about language and 55% on the highest. And I wondered if this was because I was, listening and looking, but he was a member of this group. And I know now that you are focused on language, and I can, that makes me understand that perhaps a little differently. But interestingly, in the oral feedback mode on that short lab report, it was less about language, more about thinking like a chemist. And in contrast, the social scientist, the educational psychologist, gave minimal feedback on language. And most of the feedback was on organization of thinking, because that was the underlying belief there. And when I was quite shocked when I actually looked at the scripts, the essays, because they were full of, for me, language errors and examples of poor use of language. But that didn't come through when I was listening to the think aloud with the feedback at all, because she was looking through that language. The language itself wasn't important, provided the thinking was going well. And in my applied scientist, so my cellular and molecular medicine, everything was about the visual communication there. It's really, really interesting. So the expectations of communication in chemistry as a discipline are really important then. And what I wanted to do is just to ask you to go to this Menti and finish off that sentence for me. When you are communicating, or when you're expecting your students to communicate like a chemist, how would you describe them? What should they be? So give me a couple of adjectives. They should be what in their communication? Okay, so describing how they should communicate. Hopefully you'll be, I'm not going to look at the Menti until the end, but try and think about some of the things that you value in the communication that you are trying to have your students learn or acquire. And I'm happy to talk about that in the break as well. So whilst you're thinking about that and taking part in that Menti, I'm just going to show you some of my findings, some extracts of data from the research just focused on language by my chemist participant. What two values do you think come out here? This is part of the feedback conversation, the live feedback conversation in the lab on that short lab report. Have a look. You might want to put in the chat your adjective. What am I exemplifying here? What value is being exemplified, or values? Whatever is his expectations of the language. I'm not seeing anything go in the chat, so I'll just show you my interpretation here. So I think he's saying you should be precise. Okay. And I think he's saying you should be concise. Okay, so left in the freezer is not precise enough, stored at -10 would be better. Becoming deep orange in color is not necessary, but just yeah. So two values there that perhaps you've put in the Menti, perhaps you hadn't. But let's look at an example of student language, and this is what we do when we this is what we do when we give our chemistry students or other students opportunities to develop their academic languages. We show them extracts of things that have gone wrong, choices that have gone wrong, and the feedback that the lecturer gave, so that they can avoid making those choices and make better informed choices. So here, in the context of a Year 2 lab report this time, this is what was written. Now, if you were looking at this from the point of view of languages, grammar and vocabulary, it's perfect. There are no grammatical or vocabulary mistakes. But if you look at it from what I've presented to you as language as choices of content, organization, and language based on audience and purpose, and what your values might be, what do you think's gone wrong here? What are they not being? Here's a hint. This is 29 words. If you were reading as the audience a Year 2 lab report, would you need all 29 of those words? What was coming through in my study was that there's a different audience for a lab report, a lab manual to a lab report. So our students are being exposed to the lab manual. And that's where they're doing their acquisition. That's where they're noticing language. And they're doing the same thing. They're using that as a model. But a lab report has a different audience and a different purpose to a lab manual. And so they have to make different choices in their use of language and organization and content. So this was what was considered more appropriate to the audience of a lab report, who would know what evaporation means, basically. I suggested you might even be more concise and just say after evaporation and then continue the sentence like that. But my chemistry colleague wasn't in favour of that construction, whether that's his own preference or more widely held, I don't know. So that's an example of a choice going wrong. And here in one of those live feedback conversations, quite interesting here, just read through this feedback conversation. It's on the same issue. And notice that I there is the lecturer. So the lecturer says, you haven't actually said how you did it. And then the student says, okay. And the lecturer says, I know how you did it. You cut them out and you weighed them. So the student then justifies his choice. He has chosen not to include that detail because he knows he was presenting it to an expert audience who would know what it means, how you calculate the quantum yield ratio. And you can see the lecturer sort of changes his mind and thinks, okay, you're right. But of course, it's not all students who would defend their choice in that way. And he's defending it based on what he's been told to not explain standard techniques. So how do they decide what's the standard technique? That's based on the knowledge of your audience, isn't it? So what would be, so in some of my work with the nanoscientists, for example, they were writing for each other. So they might explain a standard technique, whereas if they were writing for their lecturer, they wouldn't. Going on to another value, if you like, I'm going to just pop up. Oh, is it 5 minutes already? Pop up some extracts here. Feedback that you might have used yourself, that you might identify with. Going quite quickly now because I've got 5 minutes left. I would say that here it's about being precise, isn't it? But I think there's a difference between being precise in the way that is expected on the right of the screen versus being precise in the way that is expected on the left of the screen. Yeah, on the right of the screen there, it's about your conventions. It's about your RSC rule book, if you like. On the left of the screen, it's showing lack of understanding of the concept through a misuse of terminology, isn't it? So interesting differences there. And here's two more feedback conversations from that lab report, live feedback. And two different students here. Notice one student all the way through is just saying, yeah, yes, yeah, just monosyllabic answers, not a real dialogue taking place. The other actually engages in long turns in the dialogue. But I think here it pulls out something else. So what I would say this is an example of is register, this formality. The scientific tone is what my participant called it. But you can see here in the second box on the right, proper scientific words, not slang expressions that we use in the lab. So here they can use one scientific word in their writing and a different word, a slang expression or a different scientific word, I would say, in the lab, in the oral conversations about it. Exactly, yeah. Yeah. So so the oral language of chemistry and the written language of chemistry, again, different languages. And have I got time for this one? I'll just pop them up. You can see something that's dear to all your hearts. I'm sure it's about the visual representation of chemistry, so the visual language. And when I've been in committees across the university and there are scientists there and non-scientists, it's really interesting. You get a report and the scientists will immediately turn to the appendices and look at the data and start to form their own impressions, whereas other people wouldn't even notice there were data. And this, in my educational psychologist, for example, I didn't comment on any of the figures in the essay she was working with. I didn't even know they were there until I looked at the actual script, whereas the chemist and the cellular molecular medicine participant, they went straight for the visual. A few things here, more Englishy things. They're more things that are the traditional understanding of language that might be specific to my chemist and his particular understanding, or it might be because he knew I was listening and I was a language expert. But he did really value language. So just to finish off then, some issues for you to think about in your choices of language when giving feedback. There's the table there that you can have a look at when you get the pages, the slide, sorry. But you can see in the final column that sometimes the message, the interactional content is interfered with by the interpersonal, by knowing your student. In column 1, you can see his description of the student, and then you can see the same message about literature being delivered in quite a different way, from very direct in the oral with the top student and very indirect in the written, where the actual message might even get lost or be seen as a choice. And then oral versus written. My chemist changed focus and formulation between the written and the oral feedback. In oral mode, as I said, it was all about thinking, and there were real exploratory questions. There was real dialogue happening, real learning happening. In the written, it was, as you saw, 50+% about language, and there were very, very few questions. And where there were questions, it was rhetorical teacher questions. The teacher knew the answer already. So this is my conclusion. I think it is really important. Oh, sorry, let's go back one. Really important that you help your students notice and make choices of content, organization, and language needed for a particular audience and purpose. That's the genre idea. And be explicit about your valued ways of communicating. And also be aware of your own choices of content, organisation and language when communicating both in lectures, go read my article, a short article, and in feedback. And this is the output from the work I just did recently with vets that I just added on there at the end as well. So I have finished. Thank you very much. And I'll now try and stop sharing my screen and look at some questions. Shall I?
Thank you, Maxine, very much. And I really appreciate you sharing that perspective. As we've had in our conversations, I think it's really influential in terms of us thinking about, yeah, from me as a scientific point of view, thinking about those domains you're sharing and those insights. There's quite a lot of chat and questions, but we are a little bit tight on time. But I'm going to just highlight that maybe you can respond to in the chat. A lot of questions around how do students know? So I think this gets back to your early point about, how are we as educators explicit? I'll pick up one specific question because I think it's quite a good one from Michael, but also mention, I think Nicole Relish has comment in there about how students really are just mimicking what we do in a way in terms of they see us in lectures and in labs and how we represent, and are they not? But I think a lot of discussion that may happen in the chat, if you don't mind. But Michael O'Neill's question is, about lab write-ups. We characteristically write them in the passive voice, so the ammonia was allowed to evaporate. Do you have a perspective on this from a genre perspective? Is it convention or register or something else? So this idea, we are obsessed with writing how things were done.
Yeah, interesting. The passive voice changes the organization of the elements of a sentence. And so often students try and force things into the passive. And so the sentences don't flow together because they lose the coherence and the flow at the level of the discourse. And I think they're told, don't use personal pronouns, use the passive. But then if they look at other scientific writing, you will see that personal pronouns are used. Often we is used more frequently than I, for example, but it's only used in certain parts of the text. So again, it's the social genre is the whole text, but then there are sections of a text which have different cognitive genre, slightly different purposes, where you might be wanting to foreground your team versus the work done by the team. So passive is all about the science, but when you put a person in there, it brings in the scientist, and there might be reasons for wanting to do that. So I think it's really important not to give blank rules, but to show why did they choose to use the passive here, i.e. to foreground the science, and why did they choose to use a personal pronoun here, i.e. to foreground the team, for example. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. And I will end our chat there. I'm going to, just for the purpose of recording, I'll share the Menti. There'll be no surprises there, I think, based on what you're sharing. But can you join me, please, in thanking Maxine for a really fantastic presentation? And we are going to take a break now. We're just a bit behind. I should have said at the start, of course, that I realized only about 2 days ago that this is Thanksgiving. So apologies to all American colleagues who may have wished to have joined. Special bonus points to those who have. So while we here in UK and elsewhere will go off and have a cup of tea for 15 minutes, reconvening at 15:30, American friends, this is your time to run and get a slice of turkey, or I can't believe it's not turkey, depending on your preference. And we'll reconvene at 30 minutes past the hour. Actually, let's make it 25 minutes past by the time we warm up, and then get going at 30 minutes past. Okay, thank you to Sylvia and Maxine for the first part.